afternoon and welcome, Arsenal Nation, to the Medicine to Market Brand Breakthrough Summit. This session is focused on a function that is vital for life science companies striving to keep the patient as their North Star in everything they do. With humble beginnings predominantly in rare disease, patient advocacy has grown and evolved to expand its outreach to areas of unmet need, bringing the voice of the patient to the boardroom and beyond within life science organizations. Today, we will focus on the topic, 3 ways BioPharma can elevate, differentiate, and unlock its patient advocacy function. Helping us in this endeavor are 2 executives with dynamic backgrounds and experience in this area. Tricia Devlin, Senior Director, Global Dermatology Engagement and Partnerships with Eli Lilly and Company, and she's joined by Paul Pereira, Vice President of Patient Advocacy at Saniona. Without further ado, Tricia and Paul, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having us.
Great to see you all here. So we'll kind of just start by checking in. Tricia, can you give us a little bit of your background and describe your professional journey in patient advocacy?
Sure. So similar to a lot of colleagues in the industry, I started out in finance first, but then I went over to marketing and then sales along the way in the development of small companies. And small companies, they usually got gobbled up by the bigger pharma companies. So I got to see what good could be, how we could be nimble, but then at the same time, how we could achieve something even bigger at the bigger companies. And throughout my career in marketing and sales, I've always had a passion for the patient and always asked what the patient thinks and what the patient wants at the end of the day. And that's led me to opportunities where I've engaged or led advocacy functions at smaller and larger companies. And through that, I've brought myself to the opportunity I have today with Eli Lilly. I'm very fortunate to lead some of our global dermatology engagements around the world. So always thinking of the patient and how teams can include the patient perspective in everything we do. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thanks, Tricia. Paul, give us a little bit of your background and your dynamic journey to patient advocacy.
Absolutely. One thing is clear, there's never one straight line into patient advocacy. I think I'm a great example of that. So I began my career actually in sales, working for Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and I was going to law school nights and weekends, and I had a passion for policy, politics, government affairs. And I ended up having an opportunity in sales with, you may recall, TAP Pharmaceuticals. It was the Takeda Abbott partnership. Spent a year in sales, and then from there transitioned to my first government affairs role out in the Rocky Mountain States, out in Denver, Colorado. It was 6 years at TAP. I moved over to AstraZeneca, spent 6 years leading a team of government affairs professionals for the eastern half of the US. So throughout my 12 years in government affairs, I'd lobbied in over 40 different states on policy-related issues, chronic disease-related. I then ended up at Vertex, where I was in government affairs once again, but then after a year took my first patient advocacy role. And it was a really smooth transition because throughout my entire career, I'd spent time working with patient communities to elevate their voices on access, reimbursement, policy, payer-related issues. So at Vertex, I was responsible for cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease patient advocacy work. And after 6 years, I'm now at Saniona leading global patient advocacy for the hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome communities. And I have to tell you, it's the best place to be, I think, is in patient advocacy, because you get to experience working with patient organizations, families, caregivers, and really get to see the impact that your medicines have on their lives.
Outstanding. Well, Paul, we'll have you kick it off with our first question. And that is, when should drug developers start engaging with patient communities? And why is it important to start early?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric, and that's always one that seems to be a moving target. If you asked me a few years ago when I was really commercially focused, I would have said phase 2 and 3 is the right point, because this is when you were thinking about commercialization, access, and reimbursement challenges. But after spending a lot of time with our development team and seeing the impact that patient communities can have, I don't think it's ever too early. And even before development, you should even consider from a discovery and BD perspective. If you think about the evolution of patient advocacy, patient advocates have traditionally been known for their work in raising awareness, for educational initiatives to support communities, supporting families. But over time, they've evolved and have a really strong scientific presence, and it's expected. I mean, if you look at all of the effort that the FDA's put in and their patient-focused drug development initiatives, the work that they're doing with patient listening sessions, they're ensuring and trying to ensure that the voice of patients are included in drug development. So from a development perspective, I don't think it could happen early enough, but I mentioned about discovery. So if you think about it, patient advocacy groups being really involved in science, either from a venture philanthropy perspective, so funding research outside, but they're also conducting their own research. And if you were entering into a new therapeutic area and conducted an environmental assessment and did a stakeholder mapping, you may realize that these patient communities are researching exactly where you want to go with your trial. So take, for example, there was this great article in People magazine last summer about the SLC6A1 community. So this is a rare form of epilepsy. And this mom, when she received this diagnosis, and it was a devastating diagnosis, she started a foundation. She partnered with UT Southwestern on a gene editing opportunity. She funded a clinical trials through another biotech company to repurpose another medication. They have animal models. They have tissue samples. So if I were looking to enter into this community, it would be so impactful to know how far the community has gotten and that they are willing to collaborate and actually have scientific assets. So long answer to a short question, I think it's important to engage early for discovery, development, and ultimately delivery.
Thanks, Paul. Tricia, what insights do you have to share on involving patients in the process, perhaps even many years before a product launch?
Yeah, for sure. I've been at, as I mentioned, smaller companies and also larger companies. It depends on where you're at. I mean, no matter where you're at, you can always get patient insights and work with advocacy groups. Sometimes people have brought me in as they're getting ready to finish up their phase 3 and get ready for launch. And I always use the analogy that, okay, so we're thinking we're going to get married, and think of getting married and the ceremony as your PDUFA date. Are you going to invite your friends to get to know each other right before you send out your save the date of your big launch? Probably not. So you want to understand the community. You want to get to know them. You want to also help to bridge gaps that might already exist early and often. I've had other colleagues say to me, well, does it take a lot of money? Sometimes it can. Sometimes it can be done on a shoestring budget, depending on the department. I don't want to tell all my finance colleagues that, we don't need any budget, but at the same time, some budget to do those resources and activities are important. And I'll give you a great example. At a previous company I was at, we were very focused on patients. And we always said that if we are going to put our money where our mouth is, we were going to have a patient advocacy department and a team dedicated to raising the flag every day of listening to the community and including those insights along the whole product portfolio and development. And I tapped some of my business development colleagues on the shoulder one time, and I said, are we thinking about the patient in some of our business development deals? And they said, no, we don't usually. We think of the patient and the market research and the opportunities, but we don't usually include the patient voice. That's not in part of the usual package. And I said, well, let's do it, because if we're not thinking about the patient, then how are we really showing the value of this opportunity we might acquire? And we did do that. And a very large company was impressed with our patient aspect in our proposal. And that was one of the big decision makers as to why we got that deal with that asset. So I can say that advocacy and partnering with the community can happen across the board. It can happen early, it can happen often, but having a team or a couple people dedicated to this effort is really impactful to be the patient-focused company.
That is so interesting, and that's such a great insight. So fair to say that one of the keys to unlocking the patient advocacy function is to start early if you can. But to your point, Tricia, start where you are. Like if it's not there, get the thing rolling and get started right away.
Absolutely.
Outstanding. So we'll move on to the second question. Tricia, you'll kick us off here. And this involves the impact of patient advocacy on clinical development programs. What's been your experience with that over the years?
Yeah, I think that there's many ways that advocacy groups, individuals can impact clinical trial design and the development of new products. I can give you an example here at Eli Lilly. We have a model where we engage patients and advocacy groups at different stages of our development, like other pharma companies do. It's a more formal process, what we have. But another example at a smaller company I had is my research team was developing this new topical treatment for a dermatology condition. And they said, my goodness, this is the best formulation that doesn't exist out there. It's going to be revolutionary and patients are going to love it, and it absorbs really quickly into the skin and they're going to love it. Well, I said, let's take this out and ask some patients what they feel. And we hadn't been in clinical trials, and we took the placebo out, and in a blinded way, not market research, but we asked patients what they thought of this new formulation we were considering. I actually encouraged my research team to say, let's bring 5 different examples, even though they had really already picked A as their best. I said, let's bring all 5 just to see what the differences are. And sure enough, the patients held the cream up to the light and waved it in the air so it dried. And those were all things employees didn't think of. And one of the things that patients said is, this is too light. The one that we thought, the A example that our research team was so sure patients were going to want, the patient said, it's great. It absorbs really quickly. It absorbs faster than any of the other products on the market for this medical condition. But the problem is it's so light. As a woman and as a mother, I can't remember if I put it on before I put on my foundation and my makeup that morning. And if I get too busy with my kids, I can't remember if I put it on before I made my kids breakfast. And so if it absorbs too quickly, they're not going to remember it. And they also said that I don't want to pay $50, $60 for a copay at some point if I can't feel it. I can't feel it on the skin. I can't see it if it's invisible, if there's not a color to it. And those insights from those handful of patients, if we hadn't asked them, that would have impacted that development of that drug further on in the development. And so we did change the formulation. We changed it so that there's a color to it. We changed it so that there's a little more weight to it. And it also gave us those insights to take to the FDA as we were thinking about the development of that program altogether. So yes, there's areas that you might not think of that you can engage patients. In addition to that, always asking patients in advocacy groups, I always look in them together, but at the same time, separately, about clinical trial design, because you can get a lot of insights as to things they won't do, things they will do. But also it's a good gut check, because not always doctors know what's best for the patients that are living with these diseases. I'll turn it over to Paul, because I know he's got some great examples.
Yeah, so, I would say there's really three areas that are really key in working with clinical development teams. So one, like that old cliche, you only have one opportunity to make a first impression, right? And sometimes those are the first patient-facing materials that are seen. And I think it's important to make sure that you're incorporating the language that's culturally sensitive, language that refers to the community in ways that the community are using. So using their vernacular. Great example is working in the sickle cell disease community. They refer to themselves as warriors. So to the extent that you can incorporate the language that's important to them, you've certainly taken some steps in demonstrating that you understand the community and you care. Sidebar, you definitely want to avoid the word subject outside of the 4 walls of your company. Patient communities do not like to be referred to as subjects. From a recruitment perspective, I think recruiting principal investigators, patient advocacy organizations have scientific advisory boards. They have their finger on the pulse sometimes of the potential doctors who may want to be PIs, those that are rising stars in the community, and those that the community really respects. I had an instance where a patient advocacy group tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, there's this incredible new practice up and coming. They're interested in clinical trials. Is it possible to connect them with your CRO? We built a bridge, and ultimately this was a practice that was selected, and it came to us from a patient advocacy organization. So it was to the surprise of our CRO, and as great as they are, there are some blind spots from time to time, and patient advocacy groups can sometimes help supplement that. And then the last piece is on recruitment. So I was reading a paper from Global Genes that a quarter of all rare disease clinical trials fail, either because they meet their recruitment or retention numbers. So getting the word out and ensuring that the community is aware of these trials is incredibly important, especially in rare disease. And patient advocacy groups are terrific partners to make sure that the trial awareness is there, but also preparing you for making sure the patient experience is meaningful, because it takes so hard to find these rare disease patients who are willing volunteers that you want to make sure they stay in the study and don't leave because there was a problem with the way the study was conducted. So I mentioned that the two therapeutic areas we're researching is hypothalamic obesity and Prader-Willi syndrome. The common characteristic between the two is this condition called hyperphagia, which causes this strong desire to eat. It's really devastating. I mean, people that are afflicted with it, their families have to lock their refrigerators. They have to lock their trash cans because they will eat garbage. They have alarms in the house because sometimes they will break out of their house, break into a neighbor's home and steal their food. So it is absolutely devastating. So imagine you're conducting a clinical trial and taking those needs into account. So clearly, there won't be any candy bowls on the desk of the receptionist, but how about things like ensuring that the trial isn't taking place during lunchtime, where someone down the hall is having lunch and you could smell it throughout the building? Like, that can cause incredible anxiety for these people. Or if you're giving directions to the site, don't lead them down a path that takes them through the cafeteria. So I've been listening and gathering insights all over the world, and these insights we've been sharing with our clinical development team so that we'll try to make sure that we are not going to lose people that are enrolling in these trials because it's not taking their special needs in mind.
That is fascinating to me, and it's those considerations. It's very clear that having that connection to those patients and their families too is a key component to really making the advocacy function come to life in terms of the whole life science mission to be there for patients. That's just
maybe I could also add a couple other comments to Paul's. But colleagues sometimes will say, well, our clinical trials are locked and we're already running and we're already executing. There's always ways that you can ask patients and advocacy groups for their feedback, because guess what? There's always amendments to clinical trials. And when there is, you can include some more of those aspects the patients want in those trials. So, Paul made some really good points about the disease area he's in, but getting engagement often is always important too.
Great point.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was thinking I wanted to catch that before you got to the next topic.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tricia, and I think that's something that executives really need to keep top of mind as they're building out their efforts more broadly, especially across patient populations that are distinctly underserved. And that really that leads us into our next question, and I'll flip it back to Paul. Like, how can patient advocacy play a role in diversity and inclusion efforts at life science companies?
Yeah, so a few things. Considering patient advocacy functions are externally facing, we are in a unique position to bring in diverse viewpoints into the company. And I think a great example is when I was with another company, I had founded a employee resource network for veterans and first responders. And I collaborated with a member of the Women's Resource Network so that we were able to bring in a woman who was a veteran who had a child that was living with a rare disease who had been deployed in the military. So she was able to share her experiences as a mother, as someone that's trying to, go up the corporate ladder and care for this child with a rare disease. And it was inspirational to so many in the company from an ED&I perspective, equity, diversity, and inclusion, what it means to manage all of these things in a meaningful way. So being that we're externally facing, we do have these opportunities to make these great connections and bring them in. And the other piece is that, as I say in patient advocacy, my role is to ensure that I am the voice of the patients in the company and the conscience of the patient. So it's up to me, if not me, then who, to constantly keep pushing and ensuring that, hey, are we considering going into different areas for clinical trials? Are we reaching the right diverse patient population in the right way? When I was involved in sickle cell disease clinical trials, one avenue for outreach was working in faith-based organizations. This was arriving where the patients are, and this was something that was meaningful and an area where patient advocacy from an ED&I perspective can move the conversation a different way.
Outstanding, and that's such a key component is to really understand the scope of the disease affliction and digging, scratching beneath the surface and really digging deep is really an opportunity to include more people from different backgrounds. Tricia, I'll kind of ping this over to you. What do you feel are some best practices to consider when conducting outreach into underserved or neglected communities?
Yeah, I've got a couple examples that maybe help other colleagues, work through this at their companies. We are currently evaluating a new indication for one of our drugs that is heavily African American based. Unfortunately, there is no advocacy group out there dedicated to this community, as there is in a lot of rare diseases sometimes. But this condition is not necessarily rare in that sense. And with the Facebook groups, they're largely Caucasian people who are speaking and millennials that are speaking with this condition. So it makes it very, unusual where it's a heavily an African American population that's affected, but the people that are talking in the community are Caucasian. One of the things that I've noticed is our colleagues are saying, as we're starting to think about these clinical trials, let's reach out to some of those African American doctors and start thinking about their community of patients as well. And I've even pushed and said, hey, what about the CRO that we're thinking about doing? What are the tactical things that we're thinking about? Are we reaching out to the Black Churches of America? Are we reaching out to the National Medical Association? So even though there might not be an advocacy group that's dedicated to the patient perspective, there are other channels that you can partner and kind of surround the opportunities to better address the needs in that DE&I or that diversity aspect to get the patient insights. And when we started talking to some physicians and we said, we're looking for more African Americans who are affected with this disease, we were able to put together a small group of patients very quickly. And surprisingly, none of them knew of the Facebook group. None of them knew of another person living with this disease. So as you start to uncover some of the patient needs and start trying to help with physicians and ask those requests, you might find that there's avenues you haven't really even realized are out there or discovered. So you can kind of look around the table and see where there's opportunities there.
I find that fascinating, Tricia, because it's not just connecting the life science organization to the patients, but connecting the patients to one another, too, across, maybe cultural boundaries and some of the challenges we face as a society.
Yeah. And someday there will be an advocacy group. I'm sure there will be. But right now there's not. So we have to be thoughtful. And thankfully in my role, like in Paul's, we get to figure out where those people around the table might be sitting. They might not be sitting at a round table now, but they're sitting around a table thinking about this condition. And there are opportunities that you might not see visibly, but we can start to think about those conditions.
Fascinating. And we'll kind of roll this forward into the next question because I think you all are already touching on this, and it's something we discussed, earlier in our conversations previous to the summit. And that's along the lines of, can a strong patient advocacy presence help to fill some gaps that market research doesn't always catch? And what has been your experience in this area, whether it's before, during, or even after a commercial launch?
Would you like me to start here? Apologies.
Sure.
Okay, I can start off. Some examples of where advocacy can play a part. Sometimes when we get ready to launch a drug, and advocacy colleagues can bring the insights across the community, as I've mentioned a couple times throughout our conversation today, that the marketing team may not be thinking about. Sometimes the marketing team is thinking of that millennial that's going to be socially media savvy and going to go and ask for that potential therapy, or to raise their hand to be part of X, Y, and Z activity. Our role sometimes is to think about all the rest of the folks in that community that may not be suitable today, but in 2 years they might be. They might be 17 today and 19 in 2 years. So it doesn't mean that they're not a suitable candidate for marketing's efforts today. They might be in a couple of years. There's also areas where there's insights that you can help from a policy perspective, and I know Paul can talk about that even more closely. But there's ways that you can engage advocacy and professional patients, and sometimes to get those insights outside of the traditional market research and commercial activities as you get ready for launch.
Yeah. And just to build on that, Eric, we're talking about during commercialization. So, market access, they've got tremendous insights and resources at their disposal to determine how a medication is going to be covered. But oftentimes the patient communities are the boots on the ground, the eyes and ears. And sometimes they can act as the early warning and alert you when access isn't going according to plan. Is there suddenly a fail first policy or some sort of policy that's causing the community to be concerned about getting access to medication? So sometimes I would get calls from advocacy groups. Hey, have you heard about this policy with this particular plan, payer, or Medicaid agency? And this was always an opportunity to help educate folks in market access so that they can respond accordingly. So I can see advocacy groups being extremely instrumental when it comes to commercialization efforts and being those eyes and ears providing insights.
Paul, have you seen impact even across other functions within life science organizations, even outside of the commercial side, in your experience?
Yeah, it's really broad, especially in my experience with Saniona. So I was employee number 9 in the US, and the vision that our CEO painted for me was that, it was not only building patient insights into our development program, but to how we build ourselves as a company. So I'm educating folks across every function of Saniona. Who are our patients? Why do they matter? And what it's creating is a sense of purpose. Why are they coming to work each day? It's to help these patients, and here's why. So it's not that we're talking about hypothalamic obesity. We're talking about Amy, whose son is suffering from HO, and this is what it would mean to have a life-saving treatment for a boy like him. So yes, I've seen the impact across all of our functions through the efforts of raising awareness about the work we do.
And how can it not almost just have a galvanizing impact on all the stakeholders within a company that are all pulling in that direction? I can't think of a more sort of to really just add depth and answer the why when we go do what we do as life science professionals. So this has been extremely enlightening. I am sensing that our audience probably has some great questions for this panel. So if it's all right with the panel, I'm going to invite our man behind the scenes, Frank Dolan, to join the discussion and find out what Arsenal Nation wants to ask our distinguished panel.
Well, first of all, great job. The three of you, absolutely fantastic. So here's the first question. And that question is, my organization does not have a patient advocacy function, and we are trying to build momentum around that. Do you have any recommendations, tips, or tricks to help us get executive management to buy in to this new function? Good luck.
Fine. Paul, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I would say, we talked earlier about, engaging communities to the extent that you have, resources. And I think it's figuring out as a company, what are you trying to accomplish by engaging these communities? I think that you can start a conversation and you can always listen and learn. I think it begins with doing an assessment of determining, who are the communities that are there? Who are the patient populations you're trying to serve, and starting a conversation and just listening to the community and sharing insights. Ultimately, it's always great to have headcount and to have experienced government affairs, patient advocacy professionals, handling these issues for you. But short of that, it's being able to listen. And if you have to outsource and bring on consultants, you could certainly consider that too. There's some great consultants that do patient advocacy work.
And I can compliment at smaller companies that I've been a part of in the past. I've had that same struggle where colleagues would say, do we really need a full-time person doing this? And many times leadership says, well, if we don't have someone doing it, how are we ensuring it's getting pulled through? And so that always had resonated with us at smaller companies. But at the same time, if we're going to be a patient-focused company, why don't we have someone dedicated to always having the flag up, to ensuring the patient's voices are pulled throughout the entire development and throughout the company? And if you can't, then I have a hard time saying that how can you be a patient-focused company if you don't always have a function? It's great everyone else is thinking of the patient, but a dedicated function is always a very nice opportunity to ensure that that's there.
Thank you both. The next question is, what are ways in which we in patient advocacy can demonstrate value to the organization outside of some of their traditional metrics?
Yeah, I can start, Paul. I'd love your thoughts as well. One of the things I've done in the past is I had some colleagues that always said, oh, geez, what are you guys doing? And so we started a newsletter on a monthly basis of some of the aspects that we got insights from patients and the advocacy groups. And before you knew it, it was one of the most sought after emails on a monthly basis our colleagues asked for. Even sales reps felt like this is fantastic to know that we're thinking of the patient. They couldn't use it in promotion. I will recognize and caveat that from a compliance perspective, but it is something that you can show as not a scorecard, but something to ensure that that voice of that community is always included. Raising the awareness months and the profile of that internally is great. I've had colleagues, we wear green on a certain day during that awareness month or purple the next month for a different organization. So ensuring that we bring those wins, I guess you could say, and those small aspects of always thinking of the patient through gets people more motivated to show and build more activities.
Yep, and just to build on that, you're right. I mean, it's not objective. A lot of what we do is subjective. How do you measure this, right? And to try to add some objectivity, it would be sharing with the team to the extent, what is the global reach of these organizations? How many are they? And setting a goal of, well, I'm going to meet X amount, so that you do put some objectivity there. But along with what Tricia said, same thing, is gathering insights and sharing collected insights that you gather absolutely demonstrates value, certainly to the development team, and then the bringing in the patient voice. So the ability to bring in speakers that can help educate the company, I can see being super valuable. So having good speakers come in, having excellent content to share, I think is another way to demonstrate it.
Excellent. And I think what I'll do is I'll just provide one more, since there have been a couple of themes to the questions that have come in. And that final question from the audience is, for those of us that do have products in market, what are ways to make sure our function doesn't fall into some of the commercial trappings of having expectation to do further introductions or to move forward commercial initiatives that would be considered inappropriate?
Yeah, so I think it begins with making sure that your company has guiding principles on how you work with patient advocacy organizations. And I've been in my role for a year, and first order of business was to develop the guiding principles on how we would engage with patient communities. And integrity always is one of the items that's top of the list. So ensuring that these guiding principles provide a North Star on not just how you'll engage, but the methods that you'll employ are absolutely important. So I would say making sure that you have these guiding principles, that buy-in throughout the company on what those are, and it's up to you to live those every day.
That's sound advice. Tricia, any thoughts on making sure that we can have the appropriate division between departments and interests?
I think guiding principles is perfectly said, Paul. Sometimes I get multiple aspects or colleagues asking us to ask advocacy groups all at the same time. And I usually say, let's have an audible. Do we really need 5 requests on a Monday that are due on Friday? That's probably not the right view that we want to partner with advocacy groups and patients with. So let's think about this, and let's think about what's the most meaningful and the most thoughtful things that we can't already get in other areas. So that's one way that I always say, what's the most reasonable thing that we can get somewhere else, and also listening to the community. So well said, Paul, and to complement.
All right. Well, thank you both. Eric, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, I just want to, on behalf of Arsenal Advisors, thank Paul and Tricia for their contribution to this topic, which I think there's, like, if anyone listening, it really removes any doubt or trepidation people might have had in terms of how patient advocacy can really help to keep the patient and their voice at the North Star of everything life science organizations do. And in life science, it's all about the lives of patients. I mean, ultimately, that's our remit. And I just really am, the insights gained here, I think, hopefully will inspire other life science executives to ensure that they're doing everything they can on their end to empower their outreach to the patient community. So any final thoughts, Paul and Tricia?
I'll just close, Eric, with, to be effective at doing this, it takes time, consistency, and patience. And I would advise companies, if they're willing to do this, you need to be patient. I mean, these are typically volunteers that have day jobs, that have families, and your timelines may not quite marry up to theirs. But if you're patient and you put in the time, it's absolutely worth the endeavor.
Thanks, Paul. And Tricia?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I've mentioned this a few times. You can start early and often. And just like Paul said, no matter where you start is important. I forgot one of the comments I was going to make earlier, but sharing some of those insights with board members of your board are always really thoughtful. Another way for additional resources to be allocated, but also sharing it with some of the physicians and showing what you're doing with the patient community can go a long way. So there's many avenues that we can all engage with patients and patient advocacy groups. And like I've said in multiple different conversations, you can start early and often, and there's not always a roadmap to get there, but a lot of meaningful conversations to lead us to bigger things.
Such a perfect way to conclude our program. On behalf of Arsenal, Tricia, and Paul, thank you everyone for attending, and feel free at any point in time to contact us on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.